A mother cannot separate her maternal identity from her marital reality. The two are deeply intertwined. Mary's relationship with George Sr. is the tragic backdrop of Sheldon's upbringing, because Mary treats Sheldon as her primary emotional partner, the person whose needs always take precedence. She systematically evicts George from the center of the family. George is relegated to the role of the provider who must stay quiet, work long hours, and accept that his perspective on raising his own children is constantly vetoed. Mary's love for Sheldon creates a wedge that slowly, silently starves her marriage of intimacy and mutual respect. This emotional estrangement reaches its most damaging phase when Mary begins seeking emotional validation outside the marriage, under the guise of church work. Her relationship with Pastor Rob highlights the hypocrisy of her rigid moral standards. While she demands absolute fidelity, transparency, and sacrifice from George, she allows herself an emotional intimacy with another man that she denies her husband. Mary operates with a profound cognitive dissonance. She believes she is keeping the family together through her righteousness, even as her emotional absence drives George further into his own deep isolation. To truly understand Mary Cooper, we have to look through the lens of anxious attachment and parentification. Mary is a woman terrified of loss. We know from her backstory that before she found her intense faith, her life was chaotic and unanchored. When Sheldon was born, a child so uniquely fragile and brilliantly strange, Mary found her ultimate purpose. But that purpose quickly morphed into an anxious attachment style. She became convinced that if she relaxed her grip for even a second, Sheldon would fall apart, or worse, the world would destroy him. This anxiety drove her to unconsciously engage in the parentification of her other children, particularly Missy. Because Mary's emotional bandwidth was entirely monopolized by Sheldon's neuroses and her own marital dissatisfaction, she relied on Missy to be the easy child. Missy was expected to self-soothe, navigate the turbulent waters of adolescence alone, and even provide emotional stability for Mary during her marital crises. This is the heart of Mary's psychological paradox. She is a hyper-present mother to one child and a functionally absent mother to the other two. This psychological dynamic is laid bare when Missy finally breaks. Her rebellion isn't a typical teenage tantrum. It is a desperate structural scream to be noticed by a mother who only looks her way when she violates the family's religious rules. Mary looks at Missy's rebellion and sees a behavioral problem that needs correcting with Scripture. She completely misses the fact that it is a direct consequence of years of emotional starvation. Mary's mind cannot accept that her sacrifices for Sheldon have directly caused the psychological unraveling of her daughter. To admit that would mean admitting that her entire maternal framework was flawed from the beginning. For 7 seasons, we watch her break her own back to carry the weight of her family, only to watch the beams of her house splinter anyway. When George Sr. is tragically taken from them, the illusion of Mary's control permanently shatters. The family doesn't draw closer together under her leadership. Instead, they scatter, each carrying the specific, deep-seated wounds developed during their childhood. So, was Mary Cooper a good mother? The answer is both beautiful and devastating. She was a profoundly dedicated mother who lacked the emotional tools to love an extraordinary child without breaking her ordinary ones. She did not malice her family. She martyred them on the altar of Sheldon's potential. Mary's story is a cinematic cautionary tale about the nature of maternal devotion. It reminds us that love is not merely a feeling of intense protection. It is an act of balance. When we look back at the legacy of the Cooper household, we realize that the most dangerous thing a mother can do is love one child so much that she forgets to look at the rest of the room. Yet even that conclusion does not fully capture the tragedy of Mary Cooper, because the deepest irony of her life is that she succeeds and fails at the very same time. Sheldon grows into the brilliant theoretical physicist she always believed he could become. He wins the Nobel Prize. He changes the world of science. Every sacrifice she made appears, on the surface, to have been justified. But success has a cruel way of hiding its costs. The audience celebrates the genius who emerged from that little house in Medford, Texas, while quietly overlooking the emotional casualties left behind. Missy carries years of feeling invisible. Georgie is forced into adulthood long before he is emotionally prepared. George Sr. dies with the painful belief that history will remember him as a failure, despite spending every day trying to provide for a family that often failed to see him. Mary never intended for this outcome. In her own mind, she was simply doing what any loving Christian mother should do, protecting the child who seemed least equipped to survive the world. But parenting is not measured solely by intention, it is measured by distribution. Every family possesses a finite emotional economy. Time, patience, reassurance, affection, praise, forgiveness. These are currencies that must be shared. Whenever one child consistently receives a disproportionate share, someone else inevitably pays the bill. Mary never consciously chose Sheldon over her other children. She simply made hundreds of tiny decisions, each one understandable in isolation, that collectively communicated the same message. Sheldon's needs are emergencies. Yours can wait. Perhaps the saddest victim of this imbalance is George Sr., because he understands Sheldon in ways Mary never quite does. George recognizes that Sheldon is gifted, but he also believes the boy must learn resilience. He wants Sheldon to experience disappointment, social failure, and accountability, because he understands that genius alone cannot prepare someone for life. Mary mistakes this philosophy for cruelty. She sees George's attempts to challenge Sheldon as attacks, when in reality they are efforts to equip him for a world that will never love him as unconditionally as his mother does. Every disagreement over Sheldon becomes another fracture in their marriage, until they are no longer arguing about parenting. They are arguing about reality itself. Ironically, George often displays the emotional flexibility that Mary believes she possesses. He learns to meet Sheldon where he is without completely reorganizing the household around him. He encourages Missy, laughs with Georgie, and quietly absorbs the disappointment of being misunderstood by nearly everyone in his own home. His flaws are undeniable. He drinks too much. He can be impatient. He occasionally withdraws instead of communicating. But unlike Mary, George rarely mistakes control for love. His affection is quieter, less theatrical, and therefore easier to overlook. Mary's faith further complicates this portrait. Religion becomes both her greatest strength and her greatest defense mechanism. It gives her hope during impossible circumstances. It provides a moral framework, a supportive community, and the resilience to endure countless hardships. But it also becomes the language through which she avoids confronting painful truths. Whenever chaos threatens her carefully constructed worldview, she seeks certainty instead of reflection. She searches for biblical answers to psychological wounds. She interprets suffering as a spiritual trial, rather than asking whether some of it might have been preventable. Faith comforts her, but it also shields her from the unbearable possibility that good intentions can still produce lasting harm. And yet, despite every criticism that can be made of Mary Cooper, there remains something profoundly human about her. She is not an abusive mother. She is not indifferent. She is not selfish in the conventional sense. If anything, she sacrifices herself so completely that she loses the ability to see anyone outside the object of her sacrifice. That is precisely what makes her story so unsettling. Evil is easy to recognize because it announces itself. Tragedy often arrives disguised as love. By the end of Young Sheldon, we are left with a family that loved one another deeply, but rarely understood one another completely. Every member of the Cooper family becomes fluent in sacrifice, but almost none become fluent in emotional communication. They speak the language of duty, responsibility, and endurance far more comfortably than the language of vulnerability.